The silver eagle never touched my brother's uniform. It sat inside its velvet-lined box, mocking him, while the air in the Fort Belvoir Assembly Hall grew heavy with the smell of floor wax and expensive, nervous perfume. My hands felt cold. I gripped the plastic visitor badge so tight the edges dug into my palm. 10 years. I had spent 10 years carving out a life that didn't require their permission, and yet, here I was. Warren Cole sat in the front row, his back rigid as a ramrod. He was a retired lieutenant general who still walked like he owned the ground he stood on. Beside him, Cynthia clutched her purse, her knuckles white. She caught my eye and turned away, her chin lifting just enough to tell me I was an intruder. I sat in the back row, far from their curated circle of prestige. A soft hum of conversation drifted through the hall, punctuated by the clink of silverware from the reception area nearby. Grant, my brother, stood near the stage. He looked polished, his dress blues immaculate, his posture radiating the easy confidence of a man who believed his future was already written. He caught my gaze, smirked, and then looked past me, dismissive. He didn't know that the box on the dais wouldn't be open today. The room quieted as the commanding general arrived. I felt a shift in the air, a collective intake of breath. Darius walked toward the podium. He didn't look at my family. He scanned the room with the measured, steady gaze of a man who dealt in facts, not favor. Warren's jaw tightened. I could see the confusion ripple through the front row, followed by a sharp, sudden silence. They knew Darius had been promoted to brigadier general, but they hadn't expected him to be the keynote speaker. They hadn't expected him to stand between them and their golden son's promotion. Darius took the podium. He didn't reach for the microphone immediately. He waited, letting the silence stretch, forcing them to look at the man they'd told me was never good enough. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A low, insistent vibration. I didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. The notification would be from the Promotion Authority's administrative office. A routine procedural update, one that had been 8 months in the making. I looked at Warren's back, at the way his shoulders were already hunching, anticipating a hit he didn't understand yet. He thought this was about Darius. He thought this was about a petty family squabble over rank and respect. He had no idea. I leaned back, watching the commander of the promotion board exchange a brief, grim word with Grant's adjutant. The box containing the silver eagle disappeared from the stage. The murmurs began a wave of confusion that traveled from the front row to the back. Grant looked around, his face reddening, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He looked toward the wings, toward the officer who had just stepped off the stage, but the officer didn't look back. The ceremony wasn't starting. It was over. I stood up, the chair scraping sharply against the hardwood floor. In the sudden quiet of the hall, the sound was deafening. I didn't rush. I didn't gloat. I simply gathered my coat and walked toward the exit, my steps measured and light. 10 years ago, on my wedding day, they had walked out because I refused to sign a lie that would have saved their company but destroyed a squad of soldiers. They had erased me from their lives, wiped me from their records, and told everyone I was a lost cause, a woman manipulated by a man beneath our family station. They were right about one thing. I was a lost cause, just not theirs. I stepped out of the hall into the cool Virginia air of early October. The leaves were turning gold and russet against the sky. I took a deep breath, the chill clearing the lingering scent of floor wax from my lungs. My phone buzzed again. This time, I pulled it out. It was an email from a former logistics officer, Leah. Her name on the screen brought back the weight of the document I'd seen 8 months ago. The document I'd fought to expose. I opened the message. The text was short, blunt, the way Leah always was. "Are you coming? I have the new statement from the firm. They're trying to say it was just a filing error again." I stared at the screen. A filing error. They were still using the same language they'd used when they tried to destroy my career. They were still trying to bury the truth under a mountain of bureaucratic convenience. I looked back at the hall. Through the glass doors, I could see Grant shouting at the presiding officer, his face distorted, his perfect facade shattering in real time. Warren stood behind him, his hand gripping Grant's shoulder, not in comfort but in a desperate, frantic attempt to silence him before he said something they couldn't take back. I turned away and started toward my car. They thought today was about the promotion. They thought if they just pushed hard enough, if they just bullied the right people, the pieces would fall back into place. They hadn't realized that the pieces didn't belong to them anymore. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, heading back toward the life I had built in Alexandria, away from the manicured lawns and the suffocating expectations of the coal estate. I should have been relieved, but as I merged onto the highway, a strange, cold clarity settled over me. This wasn't the end. The hearing was still coming. The documents I'd filed 8 months ago were sitting on a desk in D.C., waiting for the sun to hit them. My phone buzzed a third time. I didn't answer it. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what they would say. They would call me, they would beg, they would threaten, and eventually, they would try to buy me. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, and focused on the road ahead. I had waited 10 years for the world to see them as they really were. I wasn't going to blink now, not when the truth was finally starting to breathe. The morning after the wedding felt like waking up in a house I didn't recognize. Sun streamed through the hotel window, hitting the patterned carpet in sharp, aggressive bars of light. My phone sat on the nightstand, vibrating against the glass surface with a rhythmic, irritating buzz. 17 missed calls, all from Cynthia. Not one from my father, not one from Grant. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I stood at the window watching the city below begin to move, feeling a strange, hollow sort of peace. A text notification lit up the screen. I did not want to touch it, but the words burned through the glass anyway. If you are not at the office by 9, the trust fund will be dissolved. You have until noon to reconsider this marriage. My stomach churned, but I didn't reach for the phone. I reached for the carafe of lukewarm coffee, poured a cup, and drank it standing up. Darius stepped into the room, his eyes scanning mine with that familiar, quiet concern. He didn't ask if I was ready. He didn't tell me to forgive them. He simply walked over, placed a hand on my shoulder, and waited. I wanted to say that I was fine, that their money never mattered, but the words caught in my throat. I had built my life around that trust. I had studied, trained, and served because I thought I was working toward a legacy. Now, the legacy was a threat. I set the cup down and went to the desk, pulling out my laptop. First order of business, severance. I opened my bank account, the one they had access to, the one they used as a leash. Transferring the balance took 3 minutes. 3 minutes to untether 10 years of expectation. I closed the accounts, changed the passwords, and set my emergency contacts to Darius. Then I found the address for the estate where we'd held the ceremony and requested a courier for my keys. I didn't need their house. I didn't need their permission. And God help me, I didn't need their name. 3 weeks later, the townhouse in Alexandria felt small, but it was ours. The kitchen table had one leg that wobbled, a piece of junk I'd found at a local estate sale, but the wood was solid. I spent an entire Saturday sanding it down, sweat dripping into my eyes, feeling the grain change under my palms. Darius watched from the doorway, holding 2 mugs of tea. He didn't hover. He didn't try to fix the table himself. He let me struggle, let me sand, let me reclaim the space with my own hands. We had a rule. No talk of the Cole family during dinner, no mention of Warren's latest strategy or Cynthia's latest social maneuver. We were building a foundation on something other than a chain of command. But the silence from them didn't mean they were gone. It meant they were waiting. The first complaint reached my commanding officer on a Tuesday. It was an anonymous message, vague and biting. suggesting my judgment in the field had been compromised by marital influence. My skin went cold as I read the words. The phrasing, the clinical, detached way it pointed out my supposed lapses felt like a mirror. I had heard Warren use those exact words in arguments over dinner when I was 19. I didn't panic. I didn't go to my commander and plead my case. Instead, I pulled up a spreadsheet. Every date, every complaint, every person who might have known about my deployment schedules. I logged the evidence, tracing the patterns, keeping the record clean. If they wanted to wage a war of whispers, I would build a fortress of logs. I stayed late in the office, ignoring the phantom weight of their expectations. I finished my master's degree in the evenings, hunched over books while Darius worked on his own reports in the living room. We were two people carving a path through a forest they had already mapped and cleared, moving into the shadows where they couldn't see us. At one point, a colleague approached me, leaning in with a conspiratorial whisper. He suggested that if I wanted a promotion, I should let him mention my father's name to the board. I smiled. A tight, thin line. I told him that if I couldn't get promoted on my own merit, I didn't want the rank. He looked at me like I was insane. Maybe I was. But then came the complaints that felt personal. Details about my grief counseling. Details from my grief counseling after my grandmother's death. Things only Cynthia knew. The spreadsheet grew. A digital ledger of betrayals. Still, I waited. I refused to accuse without proof. I refused to act like the frantic daughter they wanted me to be. Nearly 9 years after the wedding, while I was serving my 3rd year at a new command, the phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. My fingers hovered over the receiver. My pulse spiked. A sudden, frantic rhythm against my ribs. I answered. The voice on the other end was raspy, edged with a fatigue that felt familiar. Leah. She identified herself, and for a moment the world stopped spinning. She wasn't calling to catch up. She was calling because she was still dealing with the fallout of a mission that happened years ago. A mission where a piece of protective gear had failed, where her squad had been left exposed, and where someone had decided to blame the soldier instead of the equipment. She had received a file. An official investigation packet she had been denied for a decade, and inside that packet was my name. My hands felt numb. I sat down heavily in the chair, the wood creaking beneath me. I asked her to read what it said. She didn't hesitate. She read the statement, the clinical, cold accusation of user error, the claim that the equipment had been stored in direct violation of protocols. And at the bottom of the statement, there it was. My signature. I looked at the wall, at the framed photo of Darius and me on our wedding day. I didn't remember signing that document. I didn't remember ever stating that Leah had failed her men. I told her the truth, my voice steady despite the tremor in my soul. I told her I had never seen that paper before in my life. Leah was silent for a long moment. Then she asked the question that would haunt me for months. If I hadn't signed it, then who had? And why was my life still tethered to a lie I had never touched? The call ended, but the silence that followed was louder than any argument I'd ever had with Warren. I stared at my hands. They were the same hands that had sanded the kitchen table, the same hands that had filed report after report, the same hands I had used to sign every honest document of my career. They weren't the hands that had signed Leah's destruction. I needed to see the document. I needed to see what they had done in my name. I walked to the kitchen and looked at the coffee cup still sitting on the counter. The steam had long since vanished. My life had been built on the assumption that I could separate myself from them, that I could outrun their reach. But as I stood there in the quiet of the townhouse, a different reality set in. They hadn't let me go. They had been using me all along, a silent partner in their fraud, waiting for the day the past would finally catch up. I went back to the laptop, pulled up the evidence ledger, and felt the weight of the years pressing down on me. I had been careful, I had been honorable, and it hadn't been enough. I wouldn't make the same mistake twice. I wouldn't run, I wouldn't hide. I would find out how they had stolen my name, and I would make them wish they had left me completely alone. The truth was a messy, dangerous thing, but it was the only weapon I had left. And as I started to type, mapping out the next steps of a long, quiet investigation, I realized that, for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't just surviving. I was starting to fight back. The diner was empty, save for the hum of the refrigerator and a waitress wiping down the counter with a cloth that smelled of bleach. Leah sat in the corner booth, her back to the window, shoulders tense, as if bracing for a blow. I slid into the seat opposite her, my movements slow and deliberate. Maya sat beside me, a thin briefcase resting on her knees like a shield. Leah didn't offer a greeting. She pushed a file across the laminate surface. Her hands trembled, just slightly, though she tried to hide it by gripping the edge of her coffee mug. I opened the folder. The paper felt brittle, the ink faded, but the words burned into my vision. It was a formal contractor response from my father's company, dated a decade ago. And there, at the bottom, sat my signature. My breath hitched. The lines were fluid, the loops of my capital letters perfect. It looked authentic to anyone who didn't know better. I pushed the file toward Maya. She adjusted her glasses, leaning closer to the light. She didn't speak for a long time. The silence stretched until the only sound was the scratching of the waitress's cloth. Finally, Maya pointed to a tiny, microscopic blur near the tail of the letter Y. "This is a scan," Maya said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It is a digital composite." I stared at the image. The doubt that had been gnawing at me since the phone call evaporated. My chest felt hollow, a cavernous space where my trust in my family used to be. I was not angry in the way I expected to be. I felt cold, a singular, focused chill that settled deep in my marrow. Leah looked up, her eyes watery and rimmed with red. "You said you didn't sign this, Adrian. I believed you. But everyone else? They think I am the one who messed up. They think I am the reason my squad was left with faulty gear." I reached across the table, covering her hand with mine. "I never signed it, Leah, and I will prove it." Maya cleared her throat, pulling a notepad from her briefcase. "We need a strategy. This document is proof of a lie, but it is not proof of who committed the fraud. We must establish a clear chain of possession for the document. We need to know who had access to your handwriting samples. And above all, we cannot move in a way that suggests you are acting out of personal vendetta." I nodded, the words sinking into my mind with the weight of tactical commands. I understood the game. If I charged in with accusations, Warren would tear me apart. He would paint me as a disgruntled, unstable daughter who had fabricated a scandal to hurt him. I needed to move with the precision of a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. We began to list every possible source for the signature. My mind raced back to the old office, the non-disclosure agreements I had signed as a junior staffer, the stacks of paperwork Warren always left on my desk without explanation. He had been collecting samples for years. He had been building a library of my compliance, waiting for the day he needed to forge my betrayal. I went home that night and tore through my own boxes. I found an old employment contract from 12 years ago, a document I had kept because it was the first job I had ever truly loved. I laid it next to the copy of the forged statement. The similarities were horrifying. The spacing, the angle of the pen, the way my signature always trailed off at the end, they had copied it with digital precision. The realization hit me harder than I expected. They hadn't just used a pen. They had used my own history to hollow me out. Darius found me at the kitchen table, the papers spread out like a morbid puzzle. He didn't ask what I was doing. He simply placed a glass of water near my hand, his touch steady. I told him everything. I told him about the scan, about the forgery, about Leah's ruined career. His face remained calm, but I saw the flare of protective anger in his eyes. He moved to his study, closing the door behind him. When he returned, he held a single sheet of paper, a formal request for recusal. He had already drafted it, detailing his intent to distance himself from any and all proceedings involving the coal firm. He did not fight my battle, but he cleared the path so I could fight it myself. The next morning, I met with the investigators at the regional office. I didn't bring accusations, I brought questions. I presented the photograph of the empty signature page I had taken on my wedding day. The one with the timestamp that proved the document Warren had presented to me was not the one they eventually submitted. I showed them the file properties, the metadata, the paper trail that led back to their own corporate server. I submitted the protected disclosure with Maya by my side. It was a heavy, daunting stack of paper, representing the life I was about to incinerate. As I signed the final form, the ink seemed to vibrate against the page. It felt final. I should have felt relief, but as we walked out into the bright, unyielding afternoon sun, a nagging sense of dread remained. I still didn't know who had been feeding them information about my life. I didn't know how they had stayed 2 steps ahead of me for all these years. A week later, the first retaliation arrived. Cynthia called. "Adrian," she said, her voice dripping with that practiced, sweet concern that always made my skin crawl. "Your father hears you are digging through old logs again. He is worried. He says you are embarrassing the family." I held the phone away from my ear, watching a spider weave a web of vive, 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 vive in the corner of the ceiling. "I am not digging, Cynthia. I am investigating a forgery." Cynthia let out a long, weary sigh. "Your father only wants the truth you signed. If you just confirm it, this could all go away. We could be a family again." I hung up, the silence of the room rushing in to fill the void. She had confirmed it. They knew exactly what I was doing. They weren't just watching me. They were monitoring every move, every file, every inquiry I made. I sat at the table and began to draft the email to my father. I didn't get angry. I didn't threaten. I simply stated that any further communications regarding the documents would be handled exclusively by Maya Torres. I sent it, my finger hovering over the button until the confirmation ping echoed in the quiet kitchen. That night, the house felt too large, too quiet. I went to the laptop and opened the evidence ledger. My eyes scanned the lines, looking for something I might have missed. A name caught my eye. Elliot Park. He was the one who had written the original nonconformance report that Warren had buried. He was the key. He had been there when the gear failed, and he had been there when the report disappeared. Maya sent me the contact details for Elliot Park shortly after midnight. There was a brief note attached to the file. "He says you helped bury the truth." I stared at the name until the letters blurred. I had done nothing of the sort, but for 10 years, that was the story they had told everyone. I had been the one who signed the lie. I had been the one who abandoned the squad. I stood up and paced the length of the kitchen. My hands were balled into fists, my fingernails digging into my palms. I could almost hear Warren's voice, telling me that family meant sacrifice, that my name was just a tool to keep the peace. They had stolen my name, my reputation, and my honor. Now they were going to lose everything else. I would go to Elliot Park. I would show him the proof, and I would make him see that I was not the enemy he had been led to believe. I pulled my coat from the rack and stepped out into the night. The air was cold, but it felt sharp and honest against my skin. The investigation was no longer just about the gear. It was about the lie that had defined my life. I wouldn't stop until every fiber of that fabrication was burned to the ground. The library was quiet, a stark contrast to the storm currently dismantling my life. Elliot Park sat at a polished mahogany table, his hands folded neatly over a tattered leather journal. He did not look like a man who had been destroyed by a corporate machine. He looked tired. His face bore the deep-etched lines of someone who had spent a decade carrying a secret that had no place to go. Maya stood by the door, her presence a silent, professional anchor. I remained standing, needing the physical height, needing to prove to myself that I was no longer the junior officer they could push around. Elliot stared at me, his gaze lingering on the file in my hand. "You look like her," he finally said, his voice little more than a dry rasp. "Your mother had that same set to her jaw. When she was angry, she looked like she was carved out of flint." I didn't answer. I didn't want to talk about my mother. I wanted to talk about the failure, the broken gear, and the lie that had effectively ended both of our careers. I placed the photograph of the empty signature page on the table, centering it precisely between us. "I never signed it, Elliot. I had the photograph taken on my wedding day, the same morning they pressured me. The timestamp is verified. My signature was added later." He glanced at the photo, his eyes narrowing. He didn't reach for it. Instead, he pulled a small stained envelope from his jacket pocket and slid it toward me. It contained a copy of an email chain from 11 years ago. The sender was Grant. "He was so young then," Elliot said, nodding toward the paper. "He didn't know how to hide his tracks yet. He was panicked because a recall would have exposed his family's contract and destroyed the readiness success story he planned to use in his promotion case. He sent this to his father, asking what to do if your report remained in the packet. Your father told him to mark it as preliminary. That was the first step. They turned your caution into a suggestion. Then they made it vanish." I read the text, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The words were there in black and white. Grant's concern wasn't for the safety of the soldiers. It was for the bottom line. It was for his own trajectory. "How did you keep this?" I asked, looking up. Elliot shrugged. "I was the quality manager. I kept everything. I knew they would come for me eventually. I didn't keep it to be a hero. I kept it because I wanted to know when I was going to be fired. I had a daughter in college. I needed to know how much time I had left to pay her tuition." The bitterness in his tone was sharp, but not directed at me. It was directed at the vacuum of integrity that had consumed our lives. He looked at me again, his expression softening just a fraction. "I thought you were in on it, Adrian. They told us you had accepted a private settlement to stay silent. They used your absence to build the legend of the loyal daughter who chose the company over her own conscience." I felt a flash of white-hot anger, followed by the familiar cold settling of ice. They had stolen my honor, and then used it as a weapon against the people they had hurt. "I am not the enemy," I said, my voice steady, cutting through the heavy air. "I am the one who tried to stop the shipment. I am the one who refused to sign the statement. And I am the one who is going to make sure that people know the truth. I need you to testify," I added. "I need you to tell them where the raw data is kept. I need you to lead the investigators to the calibration logs." Elliot stood up. He wasn't tall, but he seemed to take up the entire room. He opened his journal to a specific page and pointed to a series of numbers. "These are the serials for the test batch. The firm still holds the retained samples in the secure archive in Prince William County. They haven't destroyed them because they were part of a long-term liability claim that never fully went to court. If you find those, you have your evidence." I didn't ask him how he knew about the archive. I didn't ask if he was afraid. I simply took the information, feeling the gravity of what we were about to start. This wasn't about a single incident anymore. This was a pattern of systemic failure that had reached its inevitable conclusion 11 months ago. That was when the second incident happened, I said, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. The second failure, the one that injured the soldier in the field. That was when they realized the old lie wouldn't hold up. They had to forge my name again, to bridge the gap. Elliot nodded. They were desperate. The contract was up for renewal. If that second failure had been linked to the first, they would have been debarred for life. They sacrificed your reputation to save their contract. I left the library with Maya, my head spinning. The pieces were locking into place, creating a picture of a conspiracy that was as simple as it was devastating. Greed, pride, and the assumption that I would never be able to pull myself out of the shadow they had cast over me. Using Elliot's serial numbers, storage map, and archive references, the investigators applied for lawful access to the Prince William County facility. Maya and I did not accompany the search. I had spent too many years protecting the integrity of my own records to compromise the chain of custody now. 2 days later, the lead investigator confirmed that the relevant server records and retained samples had been secured. He did not discuss the findings over the phone. He only told us that the evidence had been transported to a regional facility for forensic review. That restraint mattered. The case could not depend on what I believed the archive contained. It had to depend on what independent examiners could retrieve, authenticate, and explain. Grant sent me a message that evening. "You have no idea what you are doing. This is about our father, our company, and our family." I saved the message without answering. The next morning, Maya placed Grant's promotion packet on her desk. For the first time, we could see exactly how he had turned the buried equipment failure into a story of personal leadership. The promotion packet sat on Maya's desk, a thick stack of paper bound by a heavy clip. It was the centerpiece of Grant's ambition, meant to cement his transition from lieutenant colonel to colonel. I sat across from Maya, the air in the small office heavy with the smell of stale coffee. She flipped through the pages, her pen hovering over specific paragraphs. "This is the key," Maya said, pointing to a section where Grant detailed his leadership during the first equipment failure. He describes the incident as a decisive resolution of a logistical crisis, claiming he acted to prevent a recall that would have crippled brigade readiness. I leaned in, scanning the text. Grant had written that he consulted with the quality team and reached a consensus that the equipment storage was at fault. He didn't mention the after-action report I had filed, the one that explicitly stated I had found no evidence of improper storage. He had erased my voice and replaced it with a narrative of his own competence. "He uses Leah's name," I said, my voice tight as I saw the reference to the squad commander. "He lists her and her team as the ones who failed to follow protocol. He sold their reputations to build his own." Maya nodded. "He provided the paperwork to support his promotion packet. If the promotion authority accepts this narrative, he will receive the Silver Eagle of a colonel. It is a cold calculation." I thought about Leah, about the career she had lost. Grant had traded her honor for a higher rank. It wasn't just about money. It was about the way he viewed people as expendable variables in an equation that only had one correct answer: his own success. We spent the hour cross-referencing the packet with the ledger I had maintained for years. Every time Grant claimed a resolution, I could show the discrepancy in the maintenance logs. Every time he cited a storage protocol, I had the photos and reports proving that no such error occurred. The phone rang, breaking the tension. Maya answered, her eyes widening as she listened. She hung up and looked at me. "That was the ethics office. They have received your disclosure packet. They are reviewing the materials now." I felt a jolt of adrenaline. This was the moment the silence broke. Once the review board had the evidence, they couldn't ignore it. The machine had been set in motion. My phone chimed with a message from Cynthia. It was a request to call. I looked at it for a long time, the screen glowing in the dim light. "She wants to talk," I said, pushing the phone toward Maya. "Answer it on speaker," Maya suggested. "We need to know what they are thinking." I hit the button. Cynthia's voice filled the room, sounding brittle. "Adrian," she said, not waiting for a greeting, "your father is beside himself. He says the investigators are asking questions about the storage logs. He thinks you gave them access." I didn't answer. I just listened. "Grant is going to be pinned in 2 weeks," Cynthia continued, her voice rising. "You cannot do this now. If you destroy this moment for him, you destroy this family. Your father has reached out to his contacts. He thinks he can mitigate the damage if you just sign the ratification document. It is a small price to pay for peace. I looked at Maya, who shook her head vigorously. I took a steady breath. The price is not peace, Cynthia, I said. The price is the truth. I will not sign anything that lies about what happened to those soldiers. Cynthia went silent. When she spoke again, the sweetness had vanished. If you go through with this, there will be nothing left for you here. You will not have a family. Think about your future, Adrian. Think about your husband's career. Darius will not be able to protect you when the boards start looking for someone to blame. The line went dead. She just threatened Darius, I said, the realization settling over me. They think he is the one pushing this. They cannot fathom that I would ever have the courage to do this on my own. That is their biggest mistake, Maya said, her voice soft. They assume your strength is borrowed. I went home to an empty house. Darius was away, and the silence of the townhouse felt magnified. I walked through the living room, touching the edge of the wobbling kitchen table. I had spent so long trying to be the person they wanted me to be, a person who would prioritize their comfort over my own integrity. I sat at the laptop and pulled up the ratification statement they had sent that morning. It was a masterpiece of legal ambiguity, designed to be harmless while providing them with cover to dismiss any claims of fraud. I saved the document, added it to the evidence folder, and began to draft a response through Maya. We wouldn't reject it outright. We would ask for clarification on the specific storage protocols they were referencing, forcing them to commit to a lie in writing. A few hours later, I heard a sound at the door. The lock clicked, and Darius stepped inside, his uniform covered in dust. He saw me at the laptop and didn't ask questions. He walked over, kissed my head, and went to the kitchen for water. "How are you holding up?" he asked. I told him about the call, the threat, and the evidence. He listened, his focus entirely on me. "They are desperate," Darius said. "Desperate people make mistakes. They think the world still works the way it did 10 years ago, where they could control the narrative and silence anyone who got in their way. They do not realize that the systems they rely on are designed to respond to evidence, not to influence." He came over and sat beside me. "I don't care about the career," he said, his voice firm. "I care about what is right. If this costs us everything, then we will start over. We have done it before." The weight of his words felt like a lifeline. I had spent so much time worrying about the cost, about the loss of their approval, that I had forgotten the only thing that mattered. I was finally standing on solid ground. I went to bed, but sleep remained elusive. I woke up early, the sky a dark, bruised violet. I pulled up the ratification statement on the screen, looking for contradictions. Suddenly, a pattern emerged. The phrasing used in the ratification document regarding storage protocols matched the language used in the anonymous complaints I had received years ago. They weren't just forging a document, they were trying to align my past testimony with their ongoing narrative of my incompetence. I picked up the phone and dialed Maya's private number. "I found something," I said. "The language in the ratification document matches the complaint trail. This is a conspiracy to discredit a whistleblower." The realization was exhilarating. It wasn't just a single lie, it was a structure. They had built an entire alternative reality for me, a history that didn't exist, and they had been carefully maintaining it for a decade. And now, they had slipped up. They had tried to force me to sign the very document that proved the fabrication. I spent the rest of the day finalizing the response, refining the questions, and ensuring that every word was carefully chosen. I was no longer the daughter they had erased. I was the person they had forgotten to destroy, the one who had been watching, recording, and waiting for this exact moment to strike back. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows, I looked out the window. They thought they were holding all the cards, but they had forgotten the most important rule. The truth is an untamable force. Once it is revealed, it cannot be put back in the box, and it will burn through every layer of deception. I felt a sudden, profound sense of peace. The battle would be long, and it would be painful, But I was ready. I had the ledger. I had the facts. And I had the absolute, unwavering certainty that they had underestimated me one last time. The following morning, we received a courier delivery from the company. It was a formal letter from Warren's lawyer, withdrawing the ratification request and asking for a meeting to discuss a potential settlement. I read the letter, my pulse quickening, but I didn't feel the thrill I expected. They were panicked. They were testing the waters, trying to see if they could buy me off before the investigation reached a point of no return. I looked at Maya, who was watching me, waiting for my reaction. "They are offering a settlement," I said, tossing the letter onto the table. Maya smiled, a sharp, cold expression. "That means they know they are beaten. They don't want a settlement to stop the investigation. They want to limit the fallout." I didn't answer. I just watched the sunlight hitting the paper. They had spent 10 years trying to silence me, trying to erase my existence, and now they were asking for a seat at the table to negotiate their own survival. "We will not settle," I said, my voice steady. "We will let the process run its course." They deserve to face the consequences of what they have done, not just to me, but to everyone they have victimized along the way. Maya nodded. "I will draft a response declining the meeting. I will inform them that all evidence will be presented to the Promotion Review Board and that we are preparing a civil action for damages and defamation." As the afternoon dragged on, I thought about the ceremony. In a few days, Grant would be waiting for a pinning that would never come. Warren would be dealing with the fallout of his own arrogance. And Cynthia would be sitting in her house wondering how it had all gone so wrong. They had built a life on deception, and now they were being forced to live in the reality of what they had created. And I would be there to make sure they couldn't turn away. The truth was finally coming home, and for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't afraid of the future. I was looking forward to it. 2 weeks later, the morning I had been preparing for finally arrived. I entered the Fort Belvoir Assembly Hall alone and took the aisle seat I had chosen in advance. Darius arrived separately, exactly as Ethics Council had instructed. The scene unfolded as I had described it. Darius took the stage as the commanding general. Warren's confidence vanished. Grant's Silver Eagle remained inside its velvet box. When Grant's personnel representative received the formal administrative notice, the promotion ceremony was placed on hold. The notice had traveled through investigative, legal, and personnel channels before reaching the promotion authority. Darius had not called anyone. He had not issued an order. He remained recused. Grant still turned on him. "You did this," he said. "He did not file anything," I answered. "I did. 8 months ago." Grant's face changed. "You only had to sign it again," he whispered. The hall fell silent. "Again?" I asked. Warren seized Grant's arm before he could say anything else and ordered the family into a private meeting room. I followed with Maya beside me, knowing that Grant had just confirmed something the investigators had not yet been able to prove. He knew about the second signature. Warren steered Grant and Cynthia into a private meeting room off the main hall, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind them. I followed my heart, a steady drum of anticipation. Maya stayed close, her presence a silent warning that this conversation was on the record. The room smelled of old paper and dust, a claustrophobic space that felt like the inside of a tomb. Warren placed a thick, leather-bound folder on the center of the table. He did not look at me. He kept his focus on the wood, his knuckles white as he pushed the folder toward me. My father's movements were precise, stripped of the grand gestures he usually favored. "Sign this, and you get your name, your inheritance, and your family back," Warren said, his voice stripped of emotion. It was a business proposal, nothing more. I didn't reach for the folder. I didn't even lean toward it. I kept my hands folded in my lap, feeling the fabric of my uniform against my skin. The silence in the room became thick, suffocating. Cynthia looked from the folder to my face, her eyes pleading for a compliance I no longer possessed. "You put that offer in writing?" I asked, my voice calm, almost detached. Warren gave a sharp, imperious nod. Everything you need is in there. It is a full family settlement. A clean slate for everyone. Maya reached out, her fingers resting lightly on the corner of the folder. She didn't open it, she just pulled it closer so she could read the title page. I ignored the document entirely. 10 years ago, you sold this family for a single signature, I said, watching his face for any hint of remorse. Today, you are trying to sell it back using shares and stock options. Both times, you made the same mistake. You think affection is a transaction. You think I am something you can own. Warren finally looked up. His eyes were cold, devoid of the warmth I had spent so much of my youth chasing. I am trying to keep this firm afloat. I am trying to protect the legacy. Do you have any idea what will happen if this goes to a formal hearing? They will strip everything. I pushed the folder back toward him. The legacy was never yours to protect, Father. It was yours to destroy. Cynthia let out a soft, broken sound. Adrian, please. I saw you sign it that day. I know you did. I turned my attention to her. The sting of her deception was a dull, persistent ache, but the rage was gone, replaced by clarity. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone, scrolling to the message she had sent me on the day of my wedding. I held the screen out so she could see the words. She had written that I left without signing the statement, yet she had told the investigators she watched me put pen to paper. You told them you saw me, Cynthia, I said, keeping my voice low. But here, in your own words, you admitted I left the room empty-handed. Which one is the lie? Cynthia recoiled as if I had struck her. She looked at Warren, a sudden, sharp realization dawning on her face. You told me it was the only way to save Grant, she whispered, the betrayal echoing in the small room. You told me if I just swore to it, they would leave him alone. Warren did not look at her. He didn't blink. He just stared at the wall, his jaw set in a line of granite. Grant leaned against the door, his chest heaving. He looked wild, his eyes darting from the folder to the exit. If you proceed with this, people will lose jobs, he spat, his voice cracking. There will be families who lose their homes because of what you are doing. Are you proud of that? I stood up, moving toward the door. I am not the one who changed the materials, Grant. I am not the one who falsified the logs. I am the one who tried to stop you before anyone got hurt. The people who lose their jobs are the ones who were lied to by their own management. My plan involves a restructuring that keeps the honest workers in place. You aren't defending the firm. You are defending your own skin. I grabbed the handle of the door, but Warren's voice stopped me. You are nothing without this family, he said, his tone dripping with disdain. You are just a wife and a middle-ranking officer. You will be crushed before you reach the first hearing. I looked back at them, the people who had defined my world for so long. They seemed smaller now, less like giants and more like people trapped in the shrinking box of their own making. I am the only person in this room who knows who I am, I said. And then I stepped out into the hall, closing the door on the wreckage. Outside, the air felt vibrant, alive. Maya followed, her expression unreadable. She walked in silence until we reached the parking lot. They will come for us now, Maya said, opening her briefcase to secure the files. They have to. They know you have the proof. I climbed into the driver's seat, my hands steady on the wheel. They can try, I said, looking out at the fading light. But they have no idea what they are fighting. They think they are fighting a daughter. They have no idea they are fighting someone who has spent 10 years learning how to survive them. As I pulled away from the facility, I saw an ambulance parked near the service entrance. Forensic teams were already arriving, preparing to secure the site. The preservation notice had been served, and the process of recovering the deleted data from Grant's devices had begun. I didn't stop until I reached home. The house was quiet, a perfect, neutral space that didn't hold the ghosts of my father's expectations. I walked through the rooms, the emptiness feeling like a luxury. My phone rang. It was an alert from the legal office regarding the preservation notice. Grant had attempted a final desperate act. Forensic experts had found a device reset on his personal tablet, a clear attempt to destroy the digital paper trail that linked him to the complaint drafts. It didn't matter. The information was already on the servers, and the preservation notice had been issued well before he tried to wipe the data. His panic had only served to prove his intent. He had walked right into the trap. Cynthia called again, her voice barely audible. Her plea for forgiveness felt like a distant, echoey sound from another lifetime. She claimed Warren had forced her into it, that he had manipulated her fears for Grant's future. She was trying to shift the blame, trying to find a way to stay clean, but the truth was too heavy for her excuses to carry. I didn't offer comfort. I didn't offer a path back. I listened for a moment to the sound of her crying, the sound of a woman who had finally realized that her loyalty had been a currency spent on a bankrupt cause. When I finally hung up, the house felt even more still. I went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stood at the window, watching the stars emerge above the trees. The wreckage of my old life was everywhere, but it didn't belong to me anymore. The truth had started its work, and it would not stop until the cycle was broken. I turned off the lights and climbed the stairs, the quiet of the night finally feeling like home. The cold fluorescent lights of the Regional Evidence Facility buzzed, an incessant, jarring sound that grated against my nerves. An investigator, a man named Henderson, whose eyes looked as tired as Elliot's, signaled for me to remain behind the viewing glass. Maya stood next to me, her notebook open, though she didn't write anything. We were waiting for the forensic team to finalize the extraction of the raw test data from the secure archive server. The archive site was a gray, windowless bunker buried deep within Prince William County. It held the ghosts of 1,000 corporate failures, and today it was finally surrendering its most dangerous secret. Through the glass, I watched technicians in sterile gear manipulate the drive arrays. "This is where Warren thought the past would stay dead," Maya whispered, her breath fogging the clear barrier. "He relied on the assumption that nobody would ever have the authority to challenge his internal logs. He counted on the silence of his managers." I didn't answer. I just focused on the monitor hanging in the corner of the lab. A progress bar ticked forward, sluggish and inexorable. When the final percentage flickered to completion, the head technician looked up, caught my eye, and gave a sharp, definitive nod. "They found the test batch logs," the technician said, his voice amplified by the intercom system. "The calibration records for the testing equipment are pristine. But the raw data files, the ones showing the failure rates of the materials, they have been renamed and moved to a hidden partition." I felt a sudden rush of heat to my face. My hands gripped the metal railing until the edges cut into my palms. It was not a technical error. It was not a misinterpretation of protocols. It was a conscious, calculated attempt to hide the fact that the materials failed the safety standards before they were even shipped to the field. The technician continued, explaining that the non-conformance report Elliot had kept was the match for the original files. Everything aligned. The firm had been alerted that the materials were below specification, and Warren had personally signed off on the decision to ignore the warning and deploy them anyway. I turned away from the glass, my pulse a frantic drumbeat in my ears. I didn't need to see the files. I already knew what they would say. I knew because I had lived the fallout of that decision for a decade. I had watched as they blamed the soldiers, as they painted us as the careless ones who didn't know how to handle the tools they had provided us. "We have the evidence," Maya said, her voice dropping into a businesslike cadence. "We need to secure the chain of custody. We need to ensure that the retained samples at the facility are not tampered with." The agents moved with practiced efficiency. I watched them maneuver through the rows of shelves until they reached a secure cabinet labeled with the same serial numbers I had memorized from Elliot's records. They extracted the samples, the plastic bags crinkling in the quiet of the lab. My phone vibrated in my pocket, pulling me back to the present. Another message from Grant. This one was different. It wasn't a threat. It was a desperate, incoherent string of demands. He knew the archive had been accessed. He knew his digital history was being laid bare. I ignored the screen. I watched the agent seal the samples in evidence bags. "It is done," Maya said. I finally exhaled, a breath I felt like I had been holding for years. I knew that the battle ahead would be a long, exhausting grind through the legal system, but the foundation of their power had just been fractured. The next morning, the legal landscape shifted again. The company's legal counsel, a man who had once treated me with patronizing arrogance, sent a new message. They wanted to negotiate. Not a settlement, not a discussion, but a complete surrender of the firm's contested documents in exchange for a delay in the public release of the safety findings. "They are terrified," Maya told me over the phone. "They know that the moment these safety files become public, the government will move to debar them from all future contracts. They are trying to save the firm by offering up Warren and Grant as the primary architects of the fraud." I looked at the window, at the golden light of autumn hitting the trees in my yard. I had never wanted to destroy the firm. I had wanted accountability for the people who had been hurt by it. If the firm could survive without the people who had poisoned it, that was an outcome I could live with. I agreed to the terms, but only with the understanding that the evidence would be turned over to the authorities immediately, and that the firm would cooperate fully with the investigation. The final blow to their united front happened that afternoon. Warren and Grant appeared in a joint statement to the media, but the facade of familial unity was gone. Warren claimed that his son had acted against his direct orders, shielding his own culpability by painting Grant as a rogue operator. Grant, in turn, leaked a series of emails to the press that demonstrated Warren's direct involvement in the material substitution, proving that the decision to save money had come from the very top. They were tearing each other apart. I watched the news on a small television in the corner of the kitchen, the faces of the people who had once terrified me now appearing small, petty, and deeply damaged. They were so busy trying to save themselves that they didn't realize they were just providing more evidence for the investigators to piece together. Cynthia called one last time that night. She was sobbing, a thin, broken sound. Warren was demanding a divorce. Grant had stopped talking to them both. She asked me if I was satisfied. She asked if this was what I had wanted all along, to be the one who had finally brought them to their knees. I didn't answer her. I didn't have to. The silence said everything that needed to be said. I realized then that I didn't hate them. I didn't even have the energy for hatred. They were simply people who had lived a lie for so long that they had forgotten how to exist in the truth. I walked into the living room and found Darius standing there, watching me. He didn't ask what I was feeling. He simply took my hand. "They are done," he said, his voice soft but certain. "You did what you had to do." I nodded, the realization finally settling deep within my soul. I wasn't fighting a family anymore. I was closing a chapter. I looked at the table, the one I had sanded down with my own hands, and knew that the truth was the only thing that had ever been real. Everything else had been a performance, and the curtain had finally fallen. The morning of the hearing, I stood before the mirror and smoothed the fabric of my dress uniform. My reflection showed a woman who possessed a sharp, unwavering clarity. I didn't reach for the heirloom necklace my mother had once insisted I wear to every formal event, the one that always felt like a velvet noose. Instead, I left my throat bare, choosing the stark simplicity of my service ribbons. I was not there to represent their family. I was there to present the record. Darius stood by the door, his hand resting on the frame. He didn't offer to carry my bag. He didn't suggest a change in my strategy. He simply watched me with an expression of quiet, profound respect. He knew the threshold I was about to cross. He knew that after today there would be no going back, no pretense of a future reconciliation. We drove to the federal building in silence. The city of Washington, District of Columbia, seemed indifferent to the collision of lives about to take place within the courthouse walls. People moved along the sidewalks with an ease that felt entirely alien to me. They were oblivious to the fact that the architecture of a prominent military contractor was being dismantled in a room less than 1 mile away. Maya met us in the lobby, her briefcase brimming with binders. She looked at me, her gaze lingering for a heartbeat. "Are you ready, Adrian?" she asked. "I am," I replied, and for the first time in my life, I felt the truth of those words. The federal administrative hearing room was cold, a space defined by polished wood, government seals, and the sterile scent of floor wax. I took my seat, my spine against the hard back of the chair. Across the aisle, Warren and Grant sat with their own legal teams. They looked like strangers, huddled in separate pockets of silence, refusing to meet each other's eyes. Cynthia sat in the third row, her head bowed, a small, fragile figure against the dark mahogany panels. When the judge entered, the room surged to its feet, the sound of fabric and movement echoing through the vaulted space. The proceedings began with a rhythm that felt both slow and impossibly rapid. Maya's opening statement was a surgical strike, laying out the evidence of material substitution and the deliberate falsification of quality logs. She didn't rely on emotion. She relied on the serial numbers, the supplier invoices, and the internal emails that linked the executive suite directly to the decision to ignore the equipment failures. My moment to testify arrived in the mid-morning. Walking to the stand, I felt the weight of every gaze in the room. I took the oath, my voice sounding steady and resonant against the microphone. "Adrian," Maya began, "tell the court about the equipment failure you documented in the field." I recounted the incident with Leah's squad, my voice detailing the technical aspects of the material separation, the lack of support in the logs, and the after-action report I had filed to prevent the continued use of that batch. I didn't stumble. I didn't look at Warren. I looked at the judge, maintaining a level of eye contact that left no room for interpretation. The cross-examination by the company's lead attorney was a frantic, clumsy affair. He tried to suggest that I had been influenced by my marriage, that I was a disgruntled officer seeking to leverage my husband's rank. I didn't lose my temper. I didn't engage in the melodrama he was fishing for. I simply pointed to the timestamps on my reports, the maintenance logs I had saved, and the lack of any evidence supporting his claims. Every attempt he made to smear my character only served to highlight the lack of a credible defense for the firm. He wanted me to be a woman blinded by personal resentment, but the facts were too cold, too precise, and too well documented to be brushed aside by character assassination. By the afternoon, the fissures in the family's narrative began to widen. Warren took the stand, his demeanor shifting from authoritative to combative as the prosecutors questioned him about the hidden test data. He tried to claim he was kept in the dark by his managers, but the very emails Grant had leaked in his own defense, painted a different picture. Grant testified next, his voice cracking. He didn't look like the golden son who had walked into the assembly hall weeks ago. He looked small, his posture slumped, as he detailed how he had been directed to treat the report as preliminary. He threw his father to the wolves, recounting in excruciating detail how he had been forced to rewrite the incident statements to protect the contract. Cynthia was called shortly before the recess. She looked at me as she approached the stand, her expression a mix of shame and a lingering, desperate hope that I might still offer her some sign of recognition. I kept my face blank. "Mrs. Cole," the prosecutor asked, "did you sign the witness statement provided to the court regarding your daughter's signature?" Cynthia hesitated, her fingers clutching her purse. "I believed I was doing the right thing," she said, her voice shaking. "I believed my husband when he said it was necessary for the safety of the firm." The prosecutor produced the tinny, digitized printout of the email she had sent on the day of my wedding, the one where she explicitly mentioned I had left without signing. She looked at the text on the monitor, and for the first time, she seemed to realize that there was no way out of the contradiction. She turned to Warren, who sat in the gallery, his face a mask of stone. She had provided the letter She had assisted in the retaliation complaints, and she had spent years trying to maintain a lie that had finally reached its expiration date. She didn't look at me again. She simply sat there, a woman stripped of the prestige she had spent her life cultivating, realizing that the people she had sacrificed her integrity for were watching her sink without lifting a finger to stop it. The final phase of the hearing involved the evidence of the conspiracy. We presented the forensic recovery of the deleted files, including the complaint drafts that Grant had attempted to wipe from his devices. The drafts contained private information about my medical history, details only my mother could have provided. It was a clear, unvarnished trail of coordination, a sequence of events orchestrated to ensure that any objection I raised was dismissed as the erratic behavior of a compromised officer. There was a profound, suffocating silence in the courtroom as the judge studied the final exhibit. The evidence was not just a collection of documents, it was a map of a family's moral rot. It showed a path of decision-making that had prioritized the balance sheet over the lives of the soldiers. When the hearing finally adjourned, the air in the room felt thin. I walked out of the courtroom, the stone hallway echoing with the sound of my own footsteps. I didn't look back at Warren, Grant, or Cynthia. I walked toward the exit, the daylight, waiting on the other side of the heavy glass doors. The plea agreements were formalized in the weeks that followed. Warren received 6 years in federal prison, coupled with the restitution that would effectively drain the remaining equity in his interests, along with a permanent debarment from any future government contracts. Grant was dismissed from his commission, losing his rank and his future in the service, while receiving 2 years in confinement for his role in the falsification of the records. Cynthia accepted a plea involving 6 months of home detention and probation, a sentence shaped by her cooperation, her voluntary surrender of the correspondence, and the lack of evidence that she had been a participant in the material substitution itself. I had been told that justice was a process, not a feeling. Standing there in the lobby of the federal building, I felt the truth of that. There was no joy in the final verdict, no sense of triumph. There was only a profound, hollow quiet. I found Darius waiting by the entrance, his face as steady as ever. He took my hand, his grip firm. We didn't say anything until we reached the car. I looked out the window as the district vanished behind us, the sprawling city replaced by the muted colors of the suburbs. "It is over," Darius said, his voice soft against the low hum of the engine. I looked at him, realizing that the man who had been told he was not one of them was the only person who had ever truly stood by my side. He had remained a pillar of strength, untainted by the chaos I had been forced to drag him through. "It is," I said, the words finally feeling like an anchor. "We can go home." The drive back to Alexandria was long, the late afternoon light casting long, elegant shadows across the road. For the first time in a decade, I didn't feel the weight of a secret. The history of the Cole family had been stripped of its illusions, leaving behind only the wreckage of their own making. I watched the houses roll past, the families inside, the ordinary, unburdened lives they were living. I was a part of that now. I was finally free to be the person I had been carving out all along, independent, honorable, and unburdened by the expectations of people who had never known the meaning of the word family. I looked over at Darius, whose hand moved to rest against mine on the center console, and I knew that the future was no longer something I had to fear. It was mine. The fall of the House of Cole was not a dramatic collapse, but a steady, grinding erosion. Within a month, the name was stripped from the facade of the Prince William County headquarters, leaving behind faint, ghostly outlines in the brickwork that still bore the letters. The firm was sold to a logistics conglomerate that specialized in government compliance, a move that ensured the honest workers kept their livelihoods while the rot was excised. I watched the process from a distance, satisfied that the restoration of integrity had not required the total destruction of every innocent hand that had touched the machinery. Warren was transferred to a federal facility shortly after his plea. I didn't visit. I had nothing left to say to the man who believed he could trade his daughter for a contract. The veteran community, once a pillar of his social influence, had formally requested his resignation from every board and council he once commanded. His world had shrunk to a concrete cell, a space measured in paces rather than prestige. Grant fared no better in the aftermath. The military dismissal was absolute, stripping him of the title he had built his entire identity around. He sent one letter, a sprawling, frantic mess of ink that blamed Warren for every decision, claiming he had been a victim of paternal manipulation. I read it once, then put it into the shredder. He didn't take accountability for the lies he had fed the review board or the way he had weaponized Leah's name, and as long as that remained true, there was nothing for us to discuss. His fiancée had left him before the final sentencing, realizing that the man she had planned to marry was a hollow construct built on a foundation of deceit. My final meeting with Cynthia took place in the living room of the smaller townhouse where she was serving 6 months of home detention. A monitoring unit blinked beside the front door, and her probation officer had approved the visit in advance. She wore a simple gray cardigan, her hair pulled back into a severe bun that highlighted the exhaustion etched into her features. She looked diminished, the elegance she had spent a lifetime perfecting having faded into a fragile, brittle reality. She asked if I was happy with the outcome, her voice barely a whisper in the echoing room. I looked at the way her hands trembled, the same way they had when she stood beside Warren and waited for me to sign that document a decade ago. "I did not lose you because of the sentencing, Adrian," she said, leaning forward. "I lost you the day I watched you walk out of the wedding venue, and I chose to stand beside your father instead of following you. I thought if I just did what your father told me, I could preserve the family. I didn't realize I was killing it from the inside out. I watched her for a long time. I wanted to feel something, anger perhaps, or even a flicker of pity, but there was only a cold, distant observation. You did not lose me because of the investigation, Cynthia," I said. "You lost me the day you saw that blank signature page and later swore that you had watched me sign it. You didn't do it for the family. You did it to keep your place at the table." She began to cry then, the sound ragged and thin. She asked for a chance to start over, to be the mother she should have been, but she still framed the request through the lens of what she needed, not what she had taken. The cycle remained unbroken. I stood up, the chair scraping against the linoleum. I told her I would not be coming back. I didn't say it with malice. It was just a fact, as simple and undeniable as the setting sun. She watched me walk to the exit, her face etched with a realization that came too late to change anything. The weight of the last 10 years had finally shifted. I found Leah, the soldier who had been the first to call, and we met at a small cafe near the base. I handed her the corrected personnel file, the one that finally cleared her name and restored the truth about the equipment failure. She held the folder as if it were made of glass. "I didn't need the money," Leah said, her eyes bright as she looked at the pages. "I just needed to know that my children would never have to hear that their mother was a failure. You did that, Adrian. Thank you." I felt a genuine, deep-seated relief. This was the payoff of the last decade, a restoration of honor that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with the truth. I had not set out to destroy them. I had set out to protect the people they had discarded. My own career had taken a sharp turn. The military, recognizing the structural integrity I had demonstrated in the face of immense pressure, offered me a role in a new program focused on operational safety and the protection of whistleblowers. It was a position that required a firm hand and an absolute adherence to the facts, the very qualities they had once tried to manipulate. I accepted. I had finally found a purpose that didn't require me to sacrifice who I was, a place where the truth was not a liability but the primary objective. Darius remained at my side, his career continuing to thrive on its own merits, unburdened by the scandals of my past. He never once asked me to change, to soften, or to reconcile for the sake of appearances. He was the anchor I had needed when I was still drowning in the expectations of others, and standing with him now, I finally understood what a partner truly meant. On a crisp evening in early October, we hosted a dinner at our home in Alexandria. It wasn't the kind of affair that would have graced the pages of a society magazine. We didn't have crystal goblets or a caterer. We had Maya, Leah, Elliot, and a few close friends who had walked the fire with us. We sat at the wobbling kitchen table, the one I had sanded down with my own hands. The meal was simple, the conversation easy and filled with laughter. For the first time, there was no secret being whispered in the corners, no tension behind the smiles. Darius stood to offer a toast, his glass raised high. He looked around the room, his eyes lingering on each person who had helped us through the long, dark years. "To the truth," he said, his voice resonant and clear, "and to the family we chose for ourselves." I raised my glass, feeling the cool weight of the water against my fingers. I looked at the people around me, at the warmth of the home we had created, and realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for a storm. I was finally, truly, safe. Warren had been right about one thing, I thought, as the music played softly in the background. Darius would never be one of them. He had never belonged in the world of falsified logs and empty promises. And neither would I. I leaned back, watching the shadows dance against the walls, and felt a profound, exhilarating sense of freedom. The house was finally mine. Not because of a trust fund or a name on a building, but because I had earned it with my own integrity, my own choices, and my own refusal to disappear. The legacy they had tried to force upon me had turned to ash, and from that ash, I had finally built something that was entirely, irrevocably real. I took a sip of my drink, the flavor sharp and clean, and knew that the fight had been worth every single second of the struggle. You might think that your loyalty to those who raised you is a sacred debt, one that must be paid regardless of the cost to your own conscience. You may have spent years believing that keeping the peace, shielding family secrets, or signing your name to a lie is the ultimate act of devotion. But the truth is, when you are asked to sacrifice your integrity to protect someone else's reputation, you are not performing an act of love. You are participating in your own erasure. True loyalty is never predicated on silence. And a family that requires you to compromise your character to maintain its image is a family that has already abandoned its most important duty, the protection of your dignity. You have the power to define who you are, independent of the names you were born with or the roles you were assigned. When you finally choose to walk away from an environment that demands your deception, you are not acting in betrayal, you are taking the first step toward self-preservation. It takes a terrifying amount of courage to look at the people you have trusted for a lifetime and acknowledge that their version of reality is built on a foundation of shifting sand. However, remember that the moment you refuse to play your assigned part, you reclaim the narrative of your own life. You prove that your worth is not a transaction to be negotiated, but an inherent quality that no amount of pressure, threats, or emotional manipulation can diminish. Building a life that is truly your own requires you to recognize that blood is not a binding contract that forces you to endure abuse or corruption. Sometimes, the most honest thing you can do is to step out of the shadow of a damaged legacy and plant your feet on the solid, honest ground of your own choosing. You are not responsible for the consequences of someone else's unethical behavior, no matter how much they try to make you feel like the architect of their downfall. When the dust finally settles, the peace you find will not be something you earned from them, but something you secured for yourself. Have you ever stayed in a situation out of a sense of obligation, only to realize later that you were the only one holding up the weight of a lie? I would love to hear how you finally found the strength to set that burden down and claim your own truth.